Good evening, everybody. It's good to see everybody here tonight. And if you would, bow with me and we'll say a quick prayer and get started. Father, we thank you for another opportunity to gather here tonight together and learn more about you and to hear your word. And Lord, I'm asking you to open our hearts to receive and our ears to hear and help us to obey your word and to apply the things that we're taught here tonight, not just to be hearers of your word, but doers also. And I'm asking you to protect us and keep us safe throughout the rest of the week and bring us safe and sound back Sunday morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good evening. It is so good to see you and good to be with you tonight. I'm going to talk just a minute about the schedule that we're on, because our Wednesday evenings are going to change here shortly because of the summer series. So what we have this evening is 1 Kings chapters 3 through 15. We'll talk about that a little bit. Then we have 2 more Wednesday evenings in the Kings. We'll finish up 1 Kings, Lord willing, next Wednesday evening with Joey. And then we will be in 2 Kings the following Wednesday evening. And then our summer series will begin. And you can see on the screen our summer series schedule. And so then the Wednesdays during the summer series will be devoted to these topics that you can see on the screen. We'll have different speakers. David will be the first one after Wilson Adams is here. And so you can see all of that. But the reason I want to point that out to you is because in our studies on Wednesday night, we're not going to be able to continue through Chronicles and so on. All of that we'll be reading through, but our Wednesday evening classes will not cover it. We'll come back after the summer series, and we will begin with Job and then Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of the Psalms and wrap up the year that way. So the summer series kind of interrupts what we're doing on Wednesday nights, but that's okay because it will be a wonderful series for us. If you have any questions about that or are wondering about it, remember you can pick up one of these booklets. You can take a look at it. You should have received it via email, so you'll be able to look at it that way also. And so if you have any questions about that, just let us know. And then please take note of the summer series schedule. Make plans for that weekend, July 7 through the 10th, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And so you can make plans for all of that. Wilson Adams will be with us. If you want Wilson's email address to send him a note of encouragement while he's making plans to be here, just let us know, and we'll take care of that also. Okay, so let's jump into now 1 Kings in chapter 3. Our section is 1 Kings chapter 3 through chapter 15. We won't get all the way to 15, but this is a really exciting section in the history of God's people. Now, we're dealing with Solomon. Solomon is going to kind of consolidate and get everything together, and he's going to be the one in power. He's going to be the king over Israel. Now, who were the 2 kings over Israel prior to Solomon? Saul and David. So back up from Solomon, Solomon's father David, and then back up from David, King Saul. King Saul was the first king of Israel, right? Prior to King Saul, how were they governed? Judges, right. So you have that 400 and some odd years of being governed by judges. And the judges began to govern after what happened or after what event took place? How did we get into a time of the judges? Joshua died. Okay, and what happened prior to Joshua? Do what? Moses, the Exodus, and all of that. So you kind of get on the timeline, you kind of see where we are. And so we've gotten ourselves to a point where Israel is united under Saul, David, and Solomon, but with the death of Solomon that we'll get into this evening, things began to unravel again. And so an exciting time, and part of the reason it is exciting is because Israel is what they have always wanted to be during this time. They are a standalone, independent country. They are a power unto themselves, Of course, God has made this happen, but this is what they've wanted. They've desired to be, well, not just like all the other nations, but like them in government, but then more powerful and more independent than they have been since they've settled back in the Promised Land. So this should be a marvelous time for them, and in some ways it really is a wonderful time for them because, well, things are just the way they want it to be. So read with me. We're not going to read a whole lot of the whole section, but we'll read some snippets. Read with me beginning in 1 Kings chapter 3. Read with me beginning in verse 3. It says, "Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, 'Ask what you wish me to give you.' Then Solomon said, 'You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is to this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you've chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted.' Verse 9, so give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Verse 10, "It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, 'Because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have you asked for riches, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice, behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you in all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days." Okay, this is a familiar section of the life of Solomon. This is when things really begin to ramp up, and he's solidified as the king, and he becomes then what we refer to as the wisest man. So, a couple of questions about this. Is there anything in the reading, beginning in verse 3 through verse 14, is there anything in the reading that's surprising to you, or that is a little bit challenging to understand? Is there anything in there that makes you go, Okay. When you look at what is said in verse 3, sometimes it becomes a bit of a challenge for us to reconcile how God is dealing with Solomon and the people at the time. What is it in verse 3 that can be challenging for us to reconcile? What does that mean? What does it mean when it says that Solomon sacrificed on the high places? What does that mean? Let's read it again. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. What does it appear that he's doing in Gibeon? What, and I wasn't in Gibeon, so I'm asking you, what does it appear that he is doing in Gibeon? And what is our understanding of the high places? Not that that's what Solomon necessarily was doing, but what is our understanding of that? Idolatry, some sort of idolatry. That is, he appears to be offering some kind of sacrifice outside of that which God has commanded him to offer, right? Now, is it possible that he is offering sacrifices to God in his mind on those high places, in those circumstances? Is that a possibility? It is a possibility, except for the word "except" in the New American Standard. And so that word in verse 3 makes it really hard and challenging for us, because the way I typically read it is Solomon's heart was what it ought to be. Solomon had a good attitude toward God and a heart that wanted to please God. He was like his father David in that respect, except for the fact that Solomon offered sacrifices to idols. Is that a fair understanding of what's presented? Somebody's going to have to say yes or no. Okay. So that presents for us a little bit of a challenge, because we know of folks in the past who have offered, unauthorized sacrifices to God, and things have not gone so well. Who was it that offered what the text referred to as strange fire? Nadab and Abihu. What happened to them? They died pretty quick, didn't they? Yeah. They sacrificed in a way that God had not required them or asked them or commanded them to sacrifice. And so God responded to that. Yes, ma'am. Okay, and that could be, I struggle with it from the standpoint of the comparison with David. So the writer looks back to David and says Solomon had it all together like David except for this particular issue. So there is something there that is not what it ought to be from the standard of David. And yes, sir, go ahead. Sure, go ahead. Okay. It could. The idea expressed, no matter which version you look at, is we're doing okay except we have a bit of an issue here. We have a little bit of a challenge here. Now, do I believe it is the Nadab and Abihu issue literally? I do not. I do not think that, because there is a heart difference here. And so that tells us a little something. So here's kind of where we settle on that. Does God know our heart? Yes. Does He value and care about our heart? Yes. What is our intention? What are we trying to do? What are we wanting to accomplish? Yes, He cares about that. Yes, He acknowledges that. Yes, that matters to Him. Is that all that matters to Him? It is not all that matters to Him. And so He recognizes when the heart is right and the actions are not. We see that very clearly in the life of David. David's heart was right, were David's actions always right? So did the good heart excuse the bad actions? It did not. And so we kind of have to reconcile that. The good heart does not excuse the bad actions. The good intentions do not excuse us when we do the wrong thing. We just kind of have to put all that together and understand that from heaven's point of view, we can be people who have a good attitude and want to do right, but simply do not. I'll give you another example that those of you who are married can certainly relate to. Is it possible for a husband to love his wife and yet on occasion not treat her as he ought to treat her? Is that a possibility? Sure. Does the heart matter? Absolutely it does. Does a wife want a husband whose heart is devoted to her? Absolutely. Does she also want to be treated fairly and rightly? Yes, she does. And so the heart sometimes is that which determines direction, but we still have to decide what daily action is going to be like. And we can relate to that because every one of us has to deal with that in our own lives. We have to deal with that in things like work. Work is not the most important thing to us. We understand that. But there are times when it becomes primary because certain things must be done. And so the world does revolve around it for a certain amount of time. But it doesn't replace in our heart the things that are really first and top priority, even though in the moment it has to take a top spot. That kind of thing is life, and we all deal with that. What I want us to get out of this is God looks at Solomon and sees his heart and his attitude. He sees that he loves the Lord, but he's not always doing exactly what God wants him to do. Loving the Lord doesn't excuse not doing what we ought to do, but God sees all of that, and God takes all of that into consideration. So the challenge for me is what does it tell us about God when God sees Solomon having a heart like David and loving the Lord like David, but not doing what he ought to do in every instance? What does it say about God when God appears to him and says, "What can I do for you? How can I help you? Ask." What does it say about God? Grace. Goes back to his heart again, and let's let that flow. It is so that when someone has a good heart, a heart that loves the Lord, that needs to be encouraged. It needs to be built up. What we see here is grace in the Old Testament. A lot of times we think, well, and people say there's not a lot of grace in the Old Testament. And why might somebody say that? What is one reason that somebody might say, you know, there's not just a whole lot of grace in the Old Testament? Why might somebody say it? Do what? They haven't read it, yeah. Or they're only familiar with the Nadab and Abihu stories. They're only familiar with the Uzzah stories from a couple of weeks ago, where Uzzah touched the what? Ark, and God did what? Struck him dead. And so in that instance, from our perspective, which is incredibly narrow, we might say, well, not a lot of grace there. No, there is always grace with God. He is graceful toward us. It's not that he wasn't and now is. It is how he is made. Think in terms of God is love. What that means is he has always been love. He is the very essence of it, the creator of it. The principle exists because of who God is, and he's always been that way. He doesn't change. He hasn't changed. And so whatever he is today, he was then. We just have to be sure we find that aspect of him as we're looking at these stories instead of zeroing in on, well, he killed this guy, and he killed this guy, and he killed these two. And we need to have a better understanding of the text. And so here what we see is God reaching out to Solomon in grace, trying to help him. Did we see grace with David? We did. We did. We saw grace with, well, everybody where we looked. God is graceful. The wages of sin is what? Okay. Did that apply under the old law? Was that rule from heaven the same rule then as it is now? Yeah, because the wages of sin hasn't changed. What sin brings hasn't changed. What happened in the garden? Sin and then death. But what about death? Sin and immediate death? Sin and opportunity to manage the sin problem? One of the greatest examples of that to my mind is what happens in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel. God appears, speaks to Cain. Remember that? When Cain is upset, Cain is worked up, Cain is disappointed. The New American Standard says his countenance had fallen. What does that mean? He's depressed, had a bad attitude. And what does God say to him? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? So a couple of things. Number one, you have an opportunity to change. Number two, you have the power to change. You have the ability to change. That's grace. That is God extending to us opportunities. And so what you see here with Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 3 is God saying, Ask what you wish me to give you. How can I help you? I see that your heart is what it is. I see that you love the Lord. How can I help you be what you need to be to the people? Now, God's concern is not merely for Solomon. In fact, we say from time to time, God is never doing just one thing. I don't think that's a presumptive statement. I think it is just so blatantly obvious that we can say that. He's never doing just one thing. And so as he is dealing here with Solomon, he's also dealing with the people generally. He wants what's best for his people generally. And so here it is, Solomon's going to be the king, and let's see what kind of a heart he has. And so when he says, ask what you wish me to give you, Solomon's response really is perfect, isn't it? It is a response geared around the people he is intended to serve. That response is a really good lesson for you and me when it comes to our view of how we can help people and who we can serve. It is not about what can I get out of this process. It is about how can I do better in this process for the people involved. How can I help the other people involved? And I'll just tell you, among God's people, that is the prevailing mentality. It is not a selfish mentality. It is not a what can I get and what's everybody going to do for me. It is a how can I help everybody else mentality. And so Solomon looks at all of this. He realizes he's fairly young compared. And so he says there's a lot of folks here, and I'm just going to need some help in making some decisions. You ever been in a situation where you needed help making decisions? Yeah. So we have a couple of options about making decisions. What are our two options? One of them is obviously listed here. We turn to God for help. So what's the other option? We can ask the Lord to help us. We can inquire of God. We can go to His Word. We can do all of that which involves God and His wisdom. Or we can do what? Try to figure it out on our own. Yeah, go with our own wisdom. Yeah. What is proven to be the worst possible way to go for humanity? Number two, every time, yes. When we try to figure things out on our own, that is absent, not just talking to God about it, asking God and hoping and praying and counting on His providence, but also going to His Word to see what He's already said on various subjects. When we take God out of those equations, we end up with flawed logic every time. Our society is in that position now. We're making decisions and laws and rules for people that make absolutely no sense because, well, we've gotten ourselves into man's wisdom prevails. And when you have that kind of a mindset and that kind of an attitude, you end up having problems. Here, Solomon says, verse 9, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. I would suggest to you that every parent would do well to pray that very same prayer regarding family. And maybe every child also, as we all make decisions together, an understanding heart to discern between good and evil for the good of the people. That kind of a mentality, that thought process is something that's helpful to everyone. So God said, okay, because you have prayed that and have not asked for a long life, riches, or the life of your enemies, I'm going to give that to you and everything else. What does that tell you about God? What pops into your mind about God regarding how He responded to Solomon? Generous, providence. Well, He can do what He says He's going to do, right? And so, you know, sometimes people get in their minds that God is there to hold them back. Sometimes we look at God as if He's the one who's making all the rules, the rules that we have to be confined by. And people kind of get a negative attitude sometimes toward God. He's holding me back. His will is holding me back. The church that He created, the church of Christ, that Christ died for, is holding me back. All of these things are reducing me to someone who just has to do what they're told. Sometimes people go that way, and they begin to think that way, as if God somehow is the enemy in the process of life. What we see in places like this is what God really wants for His people. He wants us to be, well, okay, joyful. Doesn't mean everything's going to be fine, but God wants us to live our lives. He is not trying to hold us back from things that would be good for us. He's only trying to hold us back from things that would hurt us. And so I think about that when I see the Lord's response. He is very generous, and he wants Solomon to be successful in every way, and then he wants his people to be successful in every way. Okay, anything else about that little section before we move out of it? Yes, sir.
Quick question. And I don't know that it makes a lot of difference, but the question is everything that happens between verse 5 and through verse 14 happening in a dream?
Yes, sir. That is the way I read it. I read that it's what we might call a vision, which others have seen before, have had encounters with God in a vision before. Yep. Yes, sir. Verse 28, wrapping up that chapter, when all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. You remember the story about the two women who come. We won't take our time to look into that, but the point I want us to get is people are beginning to recognize the wisdom with which he is able to rule. What a comforting thing that must have been for your average Israelite citizen, to know that we're ruled and judged by someone who is wise and has discernment and is able to understand things. That must be a wonderful, wonderful thing. We sometimes don't have those warm, fuzzy feelings in the world today, where no matter what country you live in, sometimes we just don't have that like they must have had that then. Okay, so go over with me a little bit more. Chapter 4, we get a little bit about Solomon's wisdom and how he is growing in power. Chapter 5, his alliance with King Hiram of Tyre. They're going to supply timber for the building processes that are going to go on. And now chapter 6, it says in verse 1 of chapter 6, now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zib, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So Solomon's temple begins here 480 years after they came out of the land of Egypt. So you can use those numbers to kind of go back. And so that, again, we've said this many times, we'll say it again, that puts the Exodus from a biblical chronology standpoint somewhere around the 446 BC time frame, roughly. So as we think about it like that, we can kind of get an idea of where we are. So Solomon begins to build the house. We get details about that in chapter 6. Now go with me to chapter 7. We're going to get to a few places and settle in here. In chapter 7 of 1 Kings, in verse 1, it says, now Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. So we get a little detail about what Solomon has done here. We get more detail about the building of the temple and how all of that works. And then in chapter 8, the ark is brought into the temple. So when that happens, things begin to really get interesting, because now we have a place. We haven't had a place. We were in Egypt, then we were on the journey, and what was it? What was the place on the Exodus route for 40 years? What was the place called? The tabernacle, yeah, and it was mobile, right? It was a place for God to dwell with his people, but it went where they went, and they were always on the move. And as they have settled here, there really hasn't been a place, but now there is. And so, in verse 10 of chapter 8, well, actually go back to verse 9 of chapter 8. It says, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the sons of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. Verse 10, it happened that when the priests came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Now, that is a hard thing for me to imagine in my mind. I feel like Bible students get really good at conjuring up a vision of something in their mind, because we do that a lot, especially with the Old Testament stories, but also with the New Testament. We picture it in our minds. This one is a little challenging for me. I tend to think in terms of fog coming down, and being there, but I'm not convinced that totally gets it. So go with me over to 2 Chronicles in chapter 7, 2 Chronicles chapter 7 for another look at this. 2 Chronicles chapter 7. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. It says, "Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. The priests could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. All the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, Truly he is good. Truly his loving kindness is everlasting." I want you to think about that the whole idea of God's presence or glory descending into the temple and what that must have been like. And I'm going to ask you, can you think of another time when the presence of the Lord and the glory of the Lord prior to this had descended upon something and it was impressive? Can you think of another time prior to this where that happened? Mount Zion. Mount Sinai, yes. And so there, you'll remember, the Exodus is in process. We're a couple of months into the Exodus, and they arrive there at Horeb, Mount Sinai, and the glory of the Lord descends on the mountain. And what was present there? Fire and smoke, so much so that the Hebrew writer brings it up in chapter 12, doesn't he? And he says, you remember that? You remember back there when the glory of the Lord descended and there was fire and smoke on the mountain and the thunder and lightning and all of that? Yeah, they came to Mount Sinai, he says, but you've come, well, to Mount Zion, to the holy city. You've come to a new and better arrangement. So the reason I want to tie all that in is whatever it is we conjure up here happening with Solomon's temple and the glory of the Lord descending, whatever that is and however impressive that is, that has something to do with you and me eventually, doesn't it? And how might that be? What is the connection between what happens here, the glory of the Lord descending, so much so that the priests have to leave, everybody gets out of there? What does that have to do with you and me eventually? Okay. And what one day do we hope to see and experience? That very same glory, right? That very same presence. We're counting on that, aren't we? We're planning for that. And I don't know how to prepare ourselves for that beyond understanding what has already happened and thinking about what that must be like. We say from time to time that there's a portion of what heaven will be like that can be described simply by saying God's presence. Heaven will be heaven because God will be there. And hell, by the way, will be hell because God will not be there. It will be out of the presence of God. God will not be there. You will not have His presence there. So when we think about what heaven would be like and what that moment or that existence will be like, I want you to think about these other times when the glory of the Lord has descended and has been so impressive. And it is that kind of thing that at once you want to be a part of and then you're also afraid of it. But when we arrive with Him there, in the presence of the Lord, there'll be nothing to be afraid of. So all of that kind of comes into my mind there when you think about that. And then Solomon says in chapter 8 and verse 22, he stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, spread his hands toward heaven, and he said, verse 23 of chapter 8, O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. Solomon understands who God is, and Solomon makes the proclamation. Now, we don't have any time left. Okay, well, we've got about 30 minutes worth of work to do in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is the point where Solomon's heart turns away from God. So that's the last bell. So here's the last point we'll make about that. We read and we discussed how Solomon's heart was turned toward God. He had a good heart. He loved the Lord. Everybody got that? Solomon had a good heart and he loved the Lord. Over a period of time, and listen to this, and because of the people he surrounded himself with. Verse 4 of chapter 11 says, his heart turned away from God to other gods. I'll leave you with this. You have to guard your heart. You have to control your heart. What comes into it, what affects it, what influences it. No one else can do that for you. That's no one else's responsibility. You have to guard your heart. If someone as wise as Solomon could allow outside influences to change his heart toward God, it certainly could happen to me. You and I have to be careful about that so that our hearts remain devoted to God. Anything about that before we wrap up? Thank you so much. Keep going on the daily Bible reading, especially in the Old Testament when our summer series begins, because our classes here will be a little bit different and you'll have to keep up with that reading on your own. Thank you so much.